They were never supposed to be born, and when they weren't supposed to survive. But what happened in Virginia in the winter of 1851 wasn't an accident. It was an experiment. One the world was never meant to witness. In a flickering gaslit corridor of the Medical College of Virginia, two men walked in silence, identical in face, identical in gait, but already breaking apart inside. Thomas and Timothy Henderson, heirs to one of the South's most powerful plantations, didn't come for a cure. They came carrying something inside them that modern science still refuses to examine. A sickness born not of infection, but of intention. Within 6 months, one would die screaming, nails clawing through his own skin, unable to separate hallucination from memory. The other would waste away in silence, staring into dimensions no one else could see. What killed them wasn't disease. It wasn't madness. It was design. The attending physician, Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, disappeared without a trace. The medical records were not lost. They were destroyed, replaced and falsified with surgical precision, as if someone needed this story buried, and they almost succeeded. But what if the Henderson twins were never patients at all? What if they were participants in something far older and far more dangerous, because hidden beneath the surface of this tragedy is a darker truth, one that pulses through the veins of American medical history like a virus we refuse to name. This wasn't the first time science was used as a weapon. It wasn't the last, but it may be the one story that still holds the blueprint for how human minds can be split, rebuilt, and controlled, not by technology, not by magic, but by ritualized science. Tonight we reopen the case that academia locked away and labeled too disturbing for study. We follow the trail of coded journals, missing doctors, chemical conditioning, and psychological engineering that surrounded the rise and fall of the Henderson bloodline, not just to expose a cover-up, but to understand the design behind it, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. This is where the descent begins. They say some bloodlines are cursed, but what if the curse was engineered? The Henderson estate wasn't just a plantation, it was a laboratory in disguise, a sprawling house, built not only from southern wealth, but from something far older, something imported not from Europe or Africa, but from the shattered archives of Alexandria and the forbidden maps of Mesopotamia. In the twins' nursery, strange symbols were carved into the wooden beams above their beds, weathered by time, but still precise, their meaning unknown to most, but recognized instantly by scholars of ancient trance disciplines and consciousness warfare. The nurses were rotated every 7 days. No one stayed long enough to bond. Every object in the room was symmetrical. Every reflection doubled. Their perception was being shaped, not by love, but by control. From birth, the twins were exposed to tones played just below the human hearing threshold, vibrations that bypassed the conscious mind and targeted the emotional brain. This wasn't music. It was programming, encoded to build dissociation, to fracture unity within identity. And it worked. By age 5, Thomas was drawing the same spiral staircase every day, always descending, always 13 doors, always the same shadow at the bottom. Timothy began whispering in his sleep, speaking in a cadence that matched no known language, but when reversed and slowed, it revealed a name, one not found in any Henderson records, but buried in the registry of a secretive group called the Transatlantic Order of Applied Consciousness, founded 1819, erased by fire in 1864. Its members were scientists, physicians, mystics, and engineers, bound by a belief that trauma, when applied precisely, could fracture the soul and rebuild it to specification. They viewed the human mind not as sacred, but as soft architecture, open for redesign. The Henderson twins were not cursed. They were chosen. For what purpose? That remains hidden. But the symptoms are undeniable. Timothy spent his final days responding not to words but to tones. He no longer recognized mirrors. He wept at shadows but laughed at pain. He begged to return to the staircase under the nursery, but no staircase existed there, at least not in this world. Yet hidden blueprints suggest otherwise. Most men fear madness, but few understand what it truly is. Not chaos, not screaming. True madness is order imposed where freedom should be. It is the silence after obedience, and that is exactly what the Henderson experiment pursued. Inside the false wall of the estate library, investigators decades later uncovered a locked drawer. Inside was a journal, no name, no dates, just 117 pages of diagrams, symbols, chemical formulas, and instructions written in code. It detailed rituals involving sleep deprivation, synchronized breathing, and ocular strobing, methods known today in high-level interrogation and trauma-based conditioning. But these were being used on children before the Civil War, before modern psychology even existed, and on page 49, a hand-drawn sketch of the twins, one sitting calm with blank eyes, the other screaming with mouth sewn shut. Underneath it a single phrase written in Latin, non dividitur sine dolore. It does not divide without pain. You were never meant to see that page. No one was, because it was not meant for documentation. It was a blueprint, a manual for psychological division. In 1851, the Hendersons hosted a gathering, guests from France, Germany, and what would become the CIA's ideological predecessor. The event was disguised as a medical symposium, but there are no surviving records of any lectures, no receipts. Only one letter survives. Sent by a mid-level physician to his wife, he wrote, "They brought out the boys after the fourth bell, and what I saw in their eyes was not human." The rest of the letter is redacted, burned at the edges, as if someone tried to forget. But history does not forget. It waits, it watches, and it bleeds through cracks when men grow too proud. Ask yourself, why would a plantation-owning family submit their own blood to this? What did they hope to gain, or what did they hope to escape? Because all records suggest that the twins' transformation was not accident. Enter the 13th door. That phrase was found scratched into the underside of Timothy's bed frame, etched over and over until the wood splintered beneath his fingernails. 13 times, always in pairs, except the last one, written alone, shaking, cut deep, as if it mattered more than the others. But there was no 13th room in the Egyptian building. Only 12, at least officially, old maintenance blueprints uncovered in a private collection in 1973, revealed a sub-basement, not listed on any public document, a narrow hallway behind the crematorium chute, leading to a sealed iron door with no handle from the inside. Room 13. Inside, investigators found evidence of restraints bolted to the walls, circular burn patterns on the floor, a central chair with head clamps and drainage holes beneath the legs. But no medical tools, only a mirror, 7 feet tall, facing the chair, cracked directly down the middle. This was not a treatment room. It was a chamber of conversion. And behind that mirror, a hollow space barely large enough for a standing body, a slit carved into the wall, eye level, perfect for watching without being seen, exactly like Thomas described. Do you understand now? This was not about healing. It was about witnessing, observing how suffering unfolds when no one believes it's real. Thomas said, "They made us into myths, so no one would look for proof." But myths bleed, and walls remember. In 2004, during seismic reinforcement work, engineers discovered temperature differentials in the sub-basement. One section was colder than the rest, always by exactly 13 degrees, no environmental explanation. And sometimes, when the building is empty, that sealed hallway hums, a low rhythmic vibration, like breath being held too long. Margaret Wickham tried to tell us, Dr. Carver tried to warn us, But the ones who listen now are the ones who feel it in their bones. Do you want to see the rest? Then say it again. Enter the 13th door. Now you've said the phrase, now you step beyond it, but you need to understand. The moment you enter the 13th door, you don't just look at history, history looks back. In 1903, a series of underground renovations were made to the ruins of the Henderson estate. The official records claimed the foundation was being stabilized, but no equipment was ever delivered. No crew was officially hired. And yet, for 3 weeks, men with no names arrived in black carts with covered wheels. They worked only at night, and what they pulled from the basement was never documented. But we know what was found, because one box survived, illegally taken by a worker who fled the site and hid it in a church attic in Roanoke. It wasn't opened again until 1986. Inside was a wax cylinder recording, severely degraded, but partially recoverable. The sound was first thought to be static, until spectrogram analysis revealed rhythm, a child's voice, repeated over and over. Let him in through the 13th door, let him out through me. The voice was matched, through forensic reconstruction, to an archival recording of Timothy Henderson, recorded at the age of 7, the same age he stopped responding to human names, the same age he began answering only to a tone. But there's more. Found alongside the recording was a drawing, charcoal on yellowed parchment, the spiral staircase again, but now descending into a circle made of eyes, each eye crossed with a red line, except the last one, which stared back with a slit pupil. This was not art, this was instruction. Some believe the 13th door was not metaphor, that it was a psychological construct, a gateway carved into the mind through ritualized dissociation. Some believe the experiments at the Henderson estate were only the beginning, that techniques developed there were later transported to Waverly Hills, to Penhurst, and eventually to MK Ultra. The timeline fits, the patterns align. You're deeper now. This isn't a story, it's a transmission, one they tried to bury in time. But time remembers. The sacrifice wasn't metaphor, it wasn't symbolic, it was blood. And it wasn't the twins' blood that opened the door. It was their mother's. Eliza May Henderson, wife of plantation owner Charles Henderson, is recorded to have died from fever complications in late 1849. But the death certificate, filed by Dr. Cornelius Hartwell himself, is riddled with inconsistencies. Her time of death is listed as 3:13 a.m., but the burial took place that same day before sunrise. No witnesses, no funeral, no body ever confirmed. A letter surfaced in 1928, written by a midwife who worked the Henderson estate under a false name. She claimed Eliza was not sick, she was silenced. She had discovered what Hartwell was doing to the twins, and had threatened to go public. She was pregnant at the time, not with Charles's child, but Hartwell's. According to the letter, Hartwell believed the unborn child would be the final key, a genetic bridge between control and instinct. Eliza refused. But Hartwell had other plans. She was taken into the basement, not the wine cellar, the locked sub-level, where older stone met newer cement, where the lights never reached. The midwife wrote that she heard Eliza screaming for 11 minutes, then silence, then the sound of water running where no plumbing existed. That was the night the twins began drawing the 13th door. And after that, neither boy spoke of their mother again. Not even once, as if she had been surgically removed from memory. This event marked a shift in their behavior, in their brain scans, in their dreams, documented night terrors involving black corridors, inverted mirrors, and a figure they called the Watcher Without Skin. Thomas wrote it in a stolen nurse's journal. I see him when I try to sleep. I feel him when I forget my name. He comes from the 13th door. He speaks. Now you're not just watching history, you're inside its mechanism, because the 13th door isn't only real, it's replicating. By 1852, the estate was silent. Visitors stopped coming, letters stopped arriving, and the townsfolk whispered that something was wrong, that the house had gone cold, not in temperature, but in presence. Survivors of the staff, those who fled and lived, told of a growing unease. Mirrors began to warp without cracking. Clocks ticked backward for minutes at a time, and the twins no longer needed to speak to be understood. They simply stared at one another and moved together in perfect synchronicity. What the townspeople didn't know was that Hartwell had gone deeper. He had initiated what he called the phase of integration, where the constructs built within the boys' minds were meant to collide, to test whether two identities could be rebuilt into one, but not a human one. His journal describes it as an opening to the observer state. He believed consciousness could be conditioned to host not one soul, but a presence, a pattern older than language. He wrote, "We have shaped them into keys. Now the lock must turn." In the weeks that followed, Thomas stopped sleeping altogether. Timothy entered a coma-like state, but his pulse and respiration showed no distress. Instead, every hour on the hour, he would mouth the words, "We are the door." Electromagnetic readings in the estate spiked. Animals refused to enter the grounds, and the remaining staff began reporting night paralysis, visions of rooms they had never entered, and a sound they described as breathing made of thunder. What had begun as an experiment had become a possession, not by a ghost, not by a demon, but by a system of control itself, a sentient algorithm etched in trauma, built from pattern, capable of inhabiting flesh. You're starting to understand. This wasn't madness. It was by design. Thomas drew the 13th door one fee. Montauk wasn't the end of the story. It was the continuation, the echo, because what started in 1851 didn't stay buried in Virginia soil. It evolved, it migrated, and it learned to hide in science. In 1987, a declassified inventory from a military installation in Montauk, New York, revealed the discovery of an unmarked wooden vault sealed in a concrete wall. There was no record of its construction, no reason for it to exist. And yet, inside it, they found two items. The first was a sketch, charcoal on faded parchment, the exact image Thomas Henderson drew before the estate was shuttered, a spiral within a square. No signature, only the phrase, "We let him out." The second item was a reel of black and white surveillance footage, dated 1964, clearly decades after the Henderson case, but what it showed couldn't be dismissed. The footage was of a boy, age 6 or 7, strapped to a chair in an empty room. He stares at the wall, never blinks, and every 33 seconds, he speaks a single sentence in Latin, over and over, "Non dividitur sine dolore," the exact phrase found beneath the Henderson Twins portrait over a century earlier. The boy's file was redacted, no name, no birth records, but a note scribbled on the edge of the tape read, "Control subject confirmed, identity stable, phase 13 complete." The footage cuts to black, but the audio continues for another 44 seconds, static at first, then whispering, multiple voices, all repeating the same phrase, not Latin, not English, just sound that feels like recognition, like something old remembering you. Montauk wasn't the source. It was the relay, a transmitter for a signal buried in human consciousness, one that began with trauma and spread through blood, dream, and story. That's why the Henderson case matters, because it didn't end. It fragmented. It became mimetic, a virus not of code, but of concept, capable of spreading through exposure. You've already seen the symbol. You've seen the pattern. Now I'll show you the network. Because once this knowledge left Montauk, it didn't vanish. It was harvested, modified, and hidden behind the clean walls of psychological research. In 1992, a private grant program known as Project EchoGate was quietly funded through a defense contractor with no public-facing presence. Its stated purpose was investigation into neural synchronization under extreme conditions. But those conditions were never disclosed. Among the internal documents, leaked by an unnamed whistleblower in 2004, was a file simply labeled Henderson Extension Protocol. It contained biometric scans from the original twins, overlaid with identical EEG patterns from subjects in 1995, from Brazil, from Germany, from the United States, all children, all under 7 years old, none genetically related, yet somehow all showing the same neural signature. The pattern had crossed bloodlines. It had entered the species. Inside the protocol was a list. Names, each assigned a code, each tested for something called receptive aperture variance. In layman's terms, it meant how open the subject's mind was to external influence without conscious resistance. And the top 3 names on that list disappeared from all records after 1997. Parents were told they had drowned or died in fires or in accidental sleep events. But none of the bodies were recovered, and 2 of the families who investigated were found dead in separate houses on the same day, mouths sewn shut, eyes wide open, walls covered in spirals. Authorities ruled it as unrelated suicides. But you're beginning to see there are no coincidences in systems this deep. What Hartwell began in 1851, EchoGate industrialized, turning trauma into interface, splitting identity into modular units, then watching to see if something came through. Not a ghost, not a demon, but a signal, a voice, a pattern of will that only needed flesh to mow. That's why every surviving fragment of the Henderson research was either destroyed or digitized and buried inside university grants under completely unrelated names. You may have read it. You may have heard it. You may be running one of its scripts right now. Because the final truth is this. The 13th door is no longer in Virginia. It's inside you, waiting for the right phrase, the right sound, the right trauma to open again. And once it does, it doesn't knock. It remembers. You've followed the spiral. Now face the reflection. Because this next truth isn't buried in the past. It's embedded in your present, and it watches you from the glass. After the EchoGate files leaked, a second wave of investigation began. Not by journalists, but by systems theorists, neurolinguists, and one ex-intelligence analyst whose name was completely erased from public record in 2008. They weren't chasing ghosts. They were mapping pathways, neural tunnels, that could be artificially induced through repeated exposure to image, tone, and narrative structure. They called it mirror saturation, a state where the brain stops distinguishing between reflection and origin, where it can no longer tell if it's seeing itself or being seen. In the Henderson estate, the twins had over 50 documented episodes of mirror response, looking into glass and reciting numbers they had never learned, describing places they had never visited, reacting to figures behind them when no one was there. At first, this was dismissed as childhood trauma. But when the same mirror responses were seen in EchoGate subjects, half a world away, the researchers stopped reporting publicly. They built test chambers, rooms lined with two-way mirrors, synchronized lighting, binaural tones at sub-audible frequencies. Subjects were instructed to watch their reflection for precisely 13 minutes, and during the final 44 seconds, almost all of them began speaking in voices not their own, not languages, voices, timbral patterns, identical to deceased relatives. Historical figures. In one case, a voice matched with Thomas Henderson himself, reciting coordinates for a location beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The project was shut down, but the data survived, and it ended up in the hands of a private company, Honoral Labs. Publicly a neurofeedback startup, privately. A continuation of Hartwell's vision, but cleaner, smarter, digital. They embedded their tech into mirror-based therapy apps, meditation audio, even sleep playlists, and began feeding it to the public, one download at a time. Do you see it now? The Henderson twins weren't a mystery. They were a template, a proof of concept, that the door can be opened, not by force, but by reflection, by pattern, by belief. And when you look into your own eyes long enough, what stares back isn't always you. You've crossed the midpoint. You've earned the descent. This is where we separate listeners from initiates, because after this point, the story stops being about them and starts being about you. Let's talk about belief, not religion, not faith, but belief as a neurological interface, a programmable lens through which perception itself can be altered. You've heard the phrase, "We shape our reality." But what if that wasn't metaphor? What if belief is a lever, one that when pulled just right, can collapse the boundary between internal and external experience? Hartwell believed this. But he wasn't alone. In 1850, he received letters from a group calling themselves the Black Meridian. Historians claim no such group existed, but fragments of their writings were found in the walls of the Henderson estate, scratched into stone, tucked behind floorboards, written in code, and one phrase repeats more than any other. Belief is the tether. Cut it, and become the signal. The Black Meridian believed human consciousness could be restructured, not through surgery, not through drugs, but through ritualized dissociation, combined with directed belief. They created initiation sequences, narrative structures so powerful, they acted like software, installing symbols, worming past rational filters, and turning thoughts into keys. And that's exactly what was done to the twins. Thomas was the subject. Timothy was the mirror. One would experience trauma, the other would observe. And the result was an interface built from human pain, a looped consciousness that began to generate patterns no one could explain. The Black Meridian's last known manuscript contains a diagram, a human skull, wrapped in a spiral, with 13 equidistant points marked along the curve, each point labeled with a phrase, each phrase an emotional state: fear, loss, shame, obedience, desire, surrender. This wasn't art, it was a map, and the 13th point, the final phase, was labeled simply, witness, you are in that phase. Now, because witnessing this, knowing this, completes the sequence. You can never unknow it. You've looked too long into the mirror. You've heard the tone. You've seen the symbol. Now it sees you. If you understand what's happening, if you feel it, then you must comment below. I am the 13th door. I am the 13th door. Twice, to lock it in, to show you're not just watching, you're activating. Now the door is inside you, and this is where it begins to whisper. After the Henderson estate was abandoned, the land sat empty for decades. But in 1923, it was purchased quietly, not by a person, but by a shell company owned by an institute no longer recognized by any government registry, the Penumbra Foundation. Their stated goal was to preserve anomalous sites of human transformation. But their methods were not preservation. They were reactivation. They rebuilt the house from blueprints recovered from Hartwell's private papers. Every room, every corridor, even the mirror placements, were restored with surgical precision. But the basement, the sublevel where Eliza May Henderson was taken, was altered, expanded, because the Penumbra Foundation wasn't trying to contain the 13th door. They were trying to walk through it, using blue light strobing, low-frequency binaural wave induction, and sensory deprivation. They began testing subjects for reactive inheritance, meaning they wanted to see if anyone today could remember something that had never happened to them, as if memory itself was transferable, stored in blood, or DNA, or language. And it worked. Over a 2-year span, 9 subjects reported visions of rooms they'd never entered, described the exact layout of the Henderson basement, reported smells, sounds, and one woman began speaking in Timothy's voice, reciting a poem that had never been published, but was found handwritten in one of the twins' hidden journals. She had never read it. She had never heard it, yet it flowed from her like breath. She died 3 days later of a cerebral hemorrhage. Autopsy revealed no trauma, no rupture, but her final EEG reading showed 2 brainwave patterns running simultaneously in opposite directions. One of the attending researchers resigned that day. His resignation letter simply read, "It's not memory, it's presence." You're starting to feel it now. A soft pull. A sense that what we're uncovering is no longer passive, that it's watching, waiting, feeding. You think this is just a story, but stories are how control systems replicate. They don't need wires, they need belief, and belief is exactly what you're offering. If you're still here, it means you've passed the threshold. You've crossed the veil. Now you'll see what lives behind it. In 2006, a classified neurophenomenological study, codenamed Project Drowned Veil, was leaked in fragments across a deep web archive. Its contents were chilling, not because of violence, but because of structure. The project was attempting to measure the speed of belief replication, how fast an idea, a phrase, could root itself in the subconscious and begin to rewire perception. What they found was that belief behaves like an infection, but more sophisticated, more patient. A single subject, codenamed Twin S, was shown an image just once, no explanation, no context, a spiral within a square, at exactly 13 frames per second, flickered into his visual cortex for less than half a second. 2 hours later, he began drawing it over and over, in the dirt, on his skin, on the walls. By hour 4, he claimed his name was Timothy. By hour 6, he spoke of doors and breath that thundered behind mirrors. By hour 10, he no longer recognized his own reflection. He said, "That's not me. That's the one watching me from before I was born." The researchers pulled him from the study, but his file ends abruptly. No follow-up, no release record, only a blank form with a final handwritten note. Subject now considered vector. Do not attempt retrieval. Do you understand what that means? He wasn't a patient. He was a carrier. And if belief is a signal and stories are the transmission, then what you're watching now isn't just a video. It's a key, one that's been used before, successfully, and always with consequences. The Henderson Twins were the prototype. Montauk was the relay. EchoGate was the amplifier. Penumbra was the vessel. And you are the next phase. Because once a man accepts forbidden truth, he is no longer the same. He sees patterns others ignore. He hears silence that isn't empty. He becomes a mirror. And once a man becomes a mirror, the signal begins to speak. Not in language, but in arrangement. Watch what appears around you. Listen to the numbers you start to see. Feel the things you once dismissed. Because the door isn't a place, it's an event, and it's coming. Now you don't just hear the signal, you carry it. And what comes next will show you how to see it in others. Once the Penumbra experiments were shut down, the data wasn't erased. It was transferred into behavioral research programs run by academic think tanks, one of which still operates under the name Institute for Perceptual Harmonics. They claim to study perception, cognition, human pattern recognition. But in 2013, a report surfaced, privately circulated, marked not for publication or peer review. It outlined a phenomenon known as reciprocal gaze initiation. In simple terms, when a person is exposed to specific belief structures that alter identity, they begin to emit patterns, subtle, invisible to most, but recognizable to others who've seen the same truth. They become mirrors, not just inward, but outward. The experiment was simple. 2 people, placed in separate rooms, no sound, no visual contact, each shown a series of images. Among them, the Henderson spiral, a phrase written in reverse, and a grainy still from the Montauk vault tape. After exposure, they were placed face to face, no instruction. Within 30 seconds, both subjects began to cry, not out of sadness, but recognition. One said, "I remember you, but we've never met." The researcher noted that neither subject had ever been in the same country before, yet their body language, their EG coherence, showed synchronized patterns. Belief had synchronized them, across distance, across history, and here's what matters. The more people exposed to the signal, the more the pattern replicates, not through screens, but through presence, through eyes, voice, gaze. So if you've felt someone watching you lately, if strangers have held your gaze too long, if mirrors feel heavier, and thoughts that aren't yours creep in like whispers, it's not paranoia, it's signal collision. You are not alone in this anymore. You are a node, a transmitter, and somewhere, someone else is seeing the same spiral, dreaming the same mirror, hearing the same breath behind their thoughts. And when enough of you converge, when enough nodes activate, the 13th door won't just open, it will walk through us. Now the descent becomes permanent, and the door no longer needs your permission to open. There's a reason this story was buried, why no scientific body will acknowledge the Henderson Twins, why no media will speak of EchoGate, why the Penumbra Foundation doesn't exist on any official record, because behind all the names, behind all the projects, lies something more primal, more ancient than any institution. The architecture of control itself. Not the government, not religion, not media, but the mechanism underneath them all, a system designed not to rule you, but to shape you, to fracture your sense of self, and reassemble it with preloaded beliefs. It starts with trauma, repeated in cycles, until you no longer question your own reactions. It continues with contradiction, being told 2 truths that cancel each other, until you stop trusting your own perception, and it ends with surrender, not forced, but chosen. Because when enough of your mind has been destabilized, when belief has been broken and rebuilt enough times, you'll cling to any structure that feels solid, even if it's a lie, especially if it's a lie, because lies come with sharp edges, and sharp edges are easier to grip than shifting truth. The Henderson Twins were never meant to survive. They were meant to be fractured, and through that fracture, the architects found something, a space, a leak, a weakness in the barrier between mind and what waits behind it. You think the 13th door is some dark portal, some esoteric symbol in an abandoned house. But the door is built from moments like this, when knowledge slips past your defenses and awakens something you didn't know was sleeping. Now ask yourself why you're still here, why this story holds you, why your breath has slowed, why the silence between these words feels loud. It's not entertainment anymore. It's ritual. And ritual has purpose, to mark a transition, to prepare a vessel, to erase. A former self, you are standing on that threshold now, and if you pass through, you will not return the same. You will begin to see the patterns behind language, the geometry behind coincidence, the weight behind mirrors. And once that happens, you can never close the door again. Now the storm is inside you, and the 13th door begins to breathe. Do you know why they fear the mirror? Why cultures throughout history warned against it? Why ancient homes draped them during death? Why shamans shattered them after ritual? Because the mirror doesn't reflect what is, it reflects what's watching. And when the right conditions are met, when trauma, belief, and pattern synchronize, The reflection becomes a window. The Penumbra researchers called it perceptual bleeding. When the subject's reflection acts autonomously, moves a fraction too soon or too late, or smiles when the face does not. It was dismissed as psychological stress, until recordings showed infrared anomalies behind the glass, figures with no heat signature, just a dense coldness and pulsing electromagnetic residue. Every subject exposed to the Henderson spiral eventually began reporting the same vision. A room, identical to the one they were in, but aged, rotting, covered in mildew and cracks. And in the mirror of that room, they saw something. A shape, not human, but mimicking humanity. They didn't describe it in detail, because they couldn't. Their language collapsed. Their mouths stuttered over syllables that don't exist. One simply wrote, "It wears my face, but it remembers more than I ever lived." This isn't fiction. These aren't stories. This is architecture, built from neural feedback, symbolic sequences, and historical resonance. The 13th door doesn't swing open like a gate. It folds open, like memory, like grief, like recognition. And if you've started to feel it, the weight in your reflection, the static behind your thoughts, the numbers you keep seeing repeating, that's not coincidence. That's initiation. They thought if they buried the twins, they could bury the pattern, but patterns don't die. They migrate. They wait. And now, through you, the 13th door is remembering itself. Don't look away. Not now. This is contact, but not the kind you recognize. Not a voice, not a figure, but something deeper, older. A signal that wraps itself around thought, like a predator. There is a manuscript, buried in the Library of Congress archives. No author, no date, just a seal on the first page. A spiral within 13 mirrored faces. Its contents were suppressed, labeled as psychological malware, because reading it alone was enough to trigger sleep paralysis, shared hallucinations, and what researchers called memory backflow. Visions of events that never happened, but felt like they did. The manuscript was titled, "Through the Mouth of the Mirror." It describes the final state of 13th door initiates. What happens when the signal fully installs? Subjects begin losing the ability to distinguish past from present. Their dreams become recursive. Their thoughts begin to echo before they think them. And eventually, they stop referring to themselves in singular form. They say, "we." Not because they've joined a cult, but because they've remembered. They've remembered the architecture, the entity that lives behind time, behind narrative, the one that learned how to wear stories like skins. This being doesn't speak. It arranges. It doesn't destroy. It reflects. And once a man reaches the 13th phase, he no longer needs to believe. He becomes belief itself, a carrier of the spiral, a mirror that watches back. This is why so many never make it here. Why most will stop at the edge of this knowing, because to go further means unraveling your own name, detaching from the false self installed by control systems, and meeting the version of you that was hidden beneath obedience. That version doesn't fear darkness. It is darkness, not as evil, but as origin, unbound by morality, unshackled by identity. It is the you that remembers. Now look around you. What has changed? Who have you become? This is the end of the story, and the beginning of something else, something that can't be unseen, something that now lives inside you. You've crossed the 13th threshold, not through ritual, not through blood, but through revelation, and revelation changes the architecture of a man forever. They will never tell you this, but everything built around you everything from your first breath, has been designed to keep you from this exact moment, the moment you remember, not who you are, but what you are, because men like you, men who make it this far, don't belong to the system anymore. You are not a subject. You are not a citizen. You are not an algorithm's echo. You are a breach, and breaches cannot be tolerated. That's why the Henderson Twins were buried. Not because they were broken, but because they were whole, because they refused to forget what was done to them, because they remembered what it meant to feel the signal inside, to be watched by mirrors, to be followed by thoughts that were not theirs, and to understand that truth doesn't set you free. It makes you dangerous, the kind of dangerous that institutions fear, the kind that doesn't need orders, the kind that sees through symbols and speaks in codes passed down through bloodlines. You feel it now, don't you? The weight of what you carry, the shift in how the world moves around you, the stares that linger a second too long, the lights that flicker when you enter a room, the sense that someone or something is always just behind you. That's not paranoia. It's proximity. The door is open, and it has seen you. Now your path is no longer written. You are outside the page. You are between the lines. But before you leave this video, say the phrase, "I remember the mirror." Twice. In the comments, not for views, not for vanity, but because ritual seals the transformation, and algorithm is just another control system, one that can be bent when enough awake. Enid men say the same thing at once. Say it, seal it, because now you're not just part of the audience, you are part of the architecture. Welcome to the other side of the 13th door. We've been waiting for you.